If you can't help with the bills anymore, Margaret, you'll probably end up in a shelter somewhere, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said as she slid the stack of envelopes across the dinner table without even looking at me. My son Daniel sat beside her in complete silence, staring down into his mashed potatoes as if the pattern on the plate mattered more than the woman who had carried him for 9 months and raised him for 44 years. I looked at the overdue notices spread across the polished oak table my husband built with his own hands nearly 3 decades ago. Mortgage statements, utility bills, credit notices. One envelope had final notice stamped across it in thick red letters. Another carried my late husband's name in black ink so fresh it made my stomach tighten. Richard Whitmore. My husband had been dead for 10 days. 10 days since I stood beside his casket at St. Andrew's Church while Vanessa cried loud enough for everyone to hear. 10 days since Daniel held my hand at the cemetery and whispered that he would always take care of me. The house smelled faintly of rosemary chicken and furniture polish, but underneath it all lingered the cold scent of funeral flowers beginning to wilt in the living room. Everything felt different now. The silence in the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt occupied. The bills don't stop just because someone dies, Vanessa continued, folding her manicured hands together calmly. Daniel and I have been covering things for weeks already. I glanced at my son, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he only rubbed his forehead and sighed heavily. Mom, things are tight right now, he muttered. You know Dad left behind a lot of financial stress. My chest tightened so suddenly I almost forgot to breathe. Richard Whitmore had spent 42 years managing every dollar carefully. My husband balanced checkbooks down to the penny. He compared insurance plans like they were legal trials. He once drove 20 miles out of the way just to save 12 cents a gallon on gas during the recession of 2008. Financial stress was not a phrase that belonged beside his name. I looked back down at the papers. One document showed a home equity loan for almost $200,000. Another referenced missed payments on a business account I had never heard of before. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up the page. The signature at the bottom stopped me cold. Richard Whitmore. I stared at the looping R in Richard's name. My husband's handwriting had always been precise, steady, disciplined. This signature looked rushed somehow. Forced. When exactly did Richard sign this? I asked quietly. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. A few months ago. Before things got worse. Something about the way she answered made the room suddenly feel smaller. Daniel finally looked at me then, but only for a second. Long enough for me to notice the guilt sitting behind his tired eyes. Then he looked away again. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked loudly through the silence. Tick, tick, tick. My husband used to wind that clock every Sunday morning before church. Suddenly, I could hear his voice in my head as clearly as if he were standing beside me. If anything ever feels wrong, Maggie, don't trust appearances. I slowly placed the papers back onto the table. Vanessa exhaled impatiently. Look, nobody wants this to get ugly. But if everyone's going to stay in this house, everyone needs to contribute. Everyone. The word hit me harder than the threat itself. As if I were now just another expense living under their roof instead of the woman who helped build every inch of it. I folded my hands carefully in my lap so they would not see them shaking. Then I looked down once more at the signature on the loan document. Richard had supposedly signed it 3 days after he had already been admitted into intensive care. I barely slept that night. The rain continued long after dinner ended, tapping softly against the bedroom windows while the old maple branches scraped across the siding outside like restless fingers. Richard used to trim those branches every fall before the first frost came through Connecticut. He said dead limbs became dangerous if you ignored them too long. Lying alone in our king-sized bed for the first time in 42 years, I realized how many dangerous things had been growing quietly inside this house while I was busy grieving. The next morning, I woke before sunrise out of habit. For decades, Richard started every day at 6 sharp with black coffee, and the financial section of the newspaper spread across the kitchen table. Even after retirement, he never broke routine. The kitchen felt hollow without him there, adjusting his reading glasses and muttering about interest rates under his breath. I shuffled downstairs slowly, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself against the October chill that always settled into the house overnight. Halfway down the staircase, I stopped. Vanessa was already in the kitchen. She stood at the counter in silk pajamas, holding a stack of mail in one hand while sipping espresso from my favorite porcelain mug. My mug. The one Richard bought me during our 20th anniversary trip to Vermont. She did not notice me at first. She was too busy opening envelopes with a silver letter opener Richard kept in his office desk. I watched her separate the mail into neat piles with quick, practiced movements. Bills. Bank statements. Legal notices. Then she slid one envelope quietly into her purse before finally glancing up and seeing me standing there. For a brief second, something sharp crossed her face. Not embarrassment. Annoyance. "You startled me," she said coolly before setting the mug down. "I was organizing things." I looked at the open envelopes scattered across the marble counter. "Those are addressed to me." Vanessa shrugged lightly. "Daniel asked me to help keep things under control." Under control. As if my life had suddenly become some kind of financial emergency they needed to manage on my behalf. I walked slowly into the kitchen and poured myself coffee with slightly trembling hands. The machine hissed loudly in the silence between us. "Did Richard know about those loans?" I asked carefully without looking at her. Vanessa leaned against the counter. "Your husband did not tell you everything, Margaret." Her tone was smooth, almost rehearsed. Men sometimes hide financial problems because they want to protect their wives. I stared down into the black coffee swirling inside my cup. Richard never hid things from me. Not important things. During the recession of 1991, we sat together at this same kitchen table balancing every expense with a calculator, because Daniel needed braces and Richard refused to take on debt. When Daniel went to college, Richard picked up consulting work on weekends so we would not touch retirement savings. This was a man who kept warranty receipts inside labeled folders for 30 years. The idea that he secretly borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars without a single conversation felt impossible. Upstairs, I heard the shower running in Daniel and Vanessa's bedroom. My son had moved into the master suite just 2 days after the funeral because, according to Vanessa, it made more sense for the family. Richard's side of the closet was probably already half empty by now. The thought made my chest ache in a way I could not explain. Vanessa picked up another envelope from the counter and tapped it lightly with manicured nails. "The mortgage payment is due Friday," she said. "Daniel is already overwhelmed enough." I looked at the return address on the envelope. Fairfield National Bank. The same bank Richard stopped using nearly 12 years ago after a dispute over hidden fees. He hated that bank. Said they were dishonest. Slowly, I reached for the envelope, but Vanessa pulled it back first. "I will handle this one," she said quickly. Too quickly. And for the first time since Richard died, a quiet certainty settled deep in my stomach. Vanessa was not afraid of the bills. She was afraid of me seeing them. That afternoon, the house grew unnaturally quiet. Daniel left for work around 9, kissing Vanessa on the cheek before walking out the front door without saying goodbye to me at all. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing my coffee cup while pretending not to notice. The silence after he left felt heavier than before, as though something inside the house had shifted the moment we were alone together. Vanessa moved through the rooms with the confidence of someone rearranging a hotel she had already paid for. Cabinet doors opened and closed upstairs. Furniture scraped softly against hardwood floors. At one point, I heard Richard's office door open for the first time since the funeral. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard's office had always been sacred ground in this house. Even Daniel knocked before entering when he was a child. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel and walked toward the hallway. The office door stood slightly open. Vanessa was inside, standing beside Richard's mahogany desk while holding a small stack of folders against her chest. She turned quickly when she noticed me watching. "I am organizing paperwork," she said before I even asked. Her voice sounded too sharp, too defensive. My eyes drifted toward the open file cabinet beside her. Several drawers had already been emptied. Richard's careful labels were scattered across the desk in uneven piles. Tax records, insurance documents, property deeds. Richard spent decades organizing every important paper inside that office with military precision. Seeing strangers' hands inside his system felt deeply wrong somehow. "Daniel said we should simplify things," Vanessa continued. "There is no reason to keep old documents lying around collecting dust." Dust. That was what 42 years of marriage had become now. Dust. I stepped into the room slowly. The familiar smell of Richard's cedar aftershave still lingered faintly in the air beneath the scent of printer ink and old paper. For one painful second, I almost expected him to walk back and carrying his coffee mug while asking why we were touching his files. Instead, there was only silence. Vanessa shifted the folders higher in her arms. One corner slipped loose long enough for me to see the words power of attorney printed across the top page before she quickly tucked it back underneath the others. My pulse quickened immediately. Richard revoked his old power of attorney nearly 7 years ago after his minor stroke. I remember because we sat together in Howard Ellis's office while signing the new paperwork ourselves. "Where did you find that?" I asked quietly. Vanessa's expression froze for half a second before smoothing over again. "Daniel gave it to me." Another lie. I knew it instantly. Daniel would not even know where Richard kept legal records. Vanessa walked past me toward the hallway carrying the folders tightly against her chest like stolen merchandise. "I need to scan these before the bank closes," she said casually. Then she disappeared upstairs. I stood alone inside Richard's office listening to the grandfather clock ticking down the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Slowly, I moved toward the file cabinet. The bottom drawer remained slightly open. Inside, several folders were missing entirely. Not misplaced. Removed. Empty gaps sat between the hanging files like pulled teeth. Then I noticed something else. Richard's small black safe behind the bookshelf stood slightly crooked. Barely noticeable unless you knew exactly how meticulous he was about everything. My husband aligned picture frames with rulers. He centered lampshades by eye from across the room. That safe had never once been crooked in 12 years. I stepped closer carefully. The keypad showed faint smudges across several numbers. Fresh fingerprints. My heart began beating harder now. Someone had already tried to open it after Richard died. I reached toward the cold metal door but stopped before touching it. Suddenly, I heard Vanessa laughing softly upstairs on the phone. "She still has no idea," she whispered. The words drifted faintly through the ceiling vents above me. Then came silence. Complete silence. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized I was no longer grieving inside my own home. I was being watched inside it. That evening, I waited until Vanessa left for yoga class before entering Richard's office again. The moment the front door closed and her car disappeared down the street, the entire house seemed to exhale around me. I stood quietly in the hallway for several seconds listening to the silence. No footsteps upstairs. No cabinet doors slamming. No low whispers behind partially closed rooms. Just the ticking grandfather clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. For the first time in days, the house almost felt like mine again. Richard's office smelled exactly the way it always had. Leather. Cedarwood. Old paper. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds in long golden stripes across the carpet. Dust drifted lazily through the air above his desk. I closed the door softly behind me and walked toward the bookshelf where the safe sat hidden behind a framed photograph of our family at Cape Cod nearly 15 years earlier. Daniel had been smiling back then. Truly smiling. Before adulthood hardened him into someone I barely recognized. I carefully moved the frame aside and crouched in front of the safe. The keypad still carried faint fingerprint smudges across several numbers. 4, 7, 9, 2. I stared at them for a long moment. Richard never used random numbers for passwords. Everything meant something to him. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Dates only we understood. Slowly, I entered our wedding anniversary. Nothing. Then Daniel's birthday. Still locked. My pulse quickened slightly as I tried the address number from our first apartment in Hartford. The safe beeped angrily. One final attempt remaining before temporary lockout. I sat back against the bookshelf, suddenly exhausted. 42 years of marriage and grief still made memory feel slippery somehow. Then my eyes drifted toward the framed navy photograph on Richard's desk. He looked so young there. 22 years old with serious blue eyes and a stiff white uniform. Beneath the frame sat the small brass compass his father gave him before deployment to the Mediterranean. Richard always called it his lucky number. 49 degrees north. 49. My breath caught slightly. I turned back toward the keypad and entered the numbers carefully. 4, 9, 7, 2. The lock clicked open instantly. For a second, I simply stared at the handle without moving. Then slowly I opened the door. Inside sat a thick manila envelope, several flash drives, and a leather journal I had never seen before. Everything was arranged with the same careful order Richard brought to every part of his life. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope first. The top document nearly stopped my heart. Revocation of power of attorney. Signed 6 months earlier. Directly underneath sat a second document establishing a family trust solely under my name as primary beneficiary. My eyes scanned the legal language twice before the meaning fully settled into place. Richard had removed Daniel completely from financial authority before he died. Beneath the paperwork rested a folded handwritten letter addressed to me. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means something has already gone very wrong. I sank slowly into Richard's desk chair as tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Richard knew. Somehow, before his heart finally gave out, my husband knew something was happening inside this family. I unfolded the rest of the letter carefully. Over the past year, I noticed irregularities in our accounts. Money disappearing. Documents moved. Daniel behaving nervously whenever finances came up. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but I was not. I warned Howard Ellis privately in case anything happened to me. Do not sign anything. Do not trust verbal explanations. And most importantly, Maggie, do not let guilt blind you to manipulation. My vision blurred slightly now. Richard's handwriting remained steady all the way to the final sentence. There is a backup drive hidden beneath the bottom drawer of my desk. If you ever need the truth, it is there. Suddenly, headlights swept across the office window from outside. Vanessa's car. My heart jumped violently inside my chest. I quickly gathered the documents back into the envelope just as I heard the garage door beginning to open downstairs. By the time Vanessa walked through the kitchen carrying her designer gym bag and stainless steel water bottle, I was already sitting quietly in the living room with a blanket folded neatly across my lap and the evening news playing softly on television. The envelope from Richard's safe rested hidden beneath a loose floorboard inside the guest bedroom closet, where Daniel used to hide comic books as a child. I had not even known the floorboard was still loose until my hand brushed against it accidentally while searching for a place no one would think to check. Vanessa glanced at me briefly as she tossed her car keys into the ceramic bowl near the entryway. You are still awake? She asked casually. I thought you usually went to bed early. Smiled faintly. I could not sleep. She nodded without interest and disappeared upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard Daniel arrive home from work. Their voices drifted softly through the ceiling vents above me, while I sat perfectly still in the dark living room listening. Did she see anything? Daniel asked quietly. No, Vanessa answered immediately. She is completely lost right now. Lost. The word settled coldly into my chest. I stared at the family photographs lining the mantel above the fireplace. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. Daniel holding fishing poles beside Richard at age 12. Every picture captured moments that once felt solid and permanent. Now they look staged somehow, like memories belonging to strangers. Upstairs a floorboard creaked. Then Vanessa's voice lowered further. We need her signature before Howard gets involved. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket. Howard Ellis. Richard's attorney. The same name from the letter hidden upstairs. Daniel sighed heavily. I still think we should wait another week. And risk her asking questions? Vanessa snapped softly. Daniel, we are already behind on payments. Silence followed for several seconds. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If the bank finds out your father revoked the authorization, we are finished. I felt the blood drain slowly from my face. Revoked the authorization. Richard had been right. None of this had happened by accident. My husband knew something was wrong before he died. And whatever Daniel and Vanessa had been doing depended entirely on keeping me confused long enough to continue it. Upstairs, a bedroom door closed. Water pipes rattled softly behind the walls as someone turned on the shower. I sat motionless in the dark for almost an hour after their voices disappeared, listening to the grandfather clock count every passing minute. At 11:30, I finally rose quietly and locked the front door before heading upstairs. Richard's side of the bed still remained untouched. I had not allowed myself to sleep there since the funeral. The empty pillow beside mine carried the faintest trace of his cologne even now. I sat carefully on the mattress and opened the leather journal from the safe beneath the bedside lamp. Richard's handwriting filled every page in tight, orderly lines. Most entries were simple financial notes at first. Dates, transfers, account numbers. But as the weeks progressed, the tone changed. Daniel asked strange questions about the trust today. Vanessa requested copies of my signatures again. I pretended not to notice. A later entry stopped me cold. Found unauthorized withdrawal requests from business reserve account. Signature appears altered. Daniel avoided eye contact entire dinner. Vanessa overly pleasant afterward. I rubbed my trembling fingers slowly across the page. Richard had been documenting everything. Every suspicion. Every irregularity. Every warning sign. Toward the back of the journal, one final note had been underlined twice in dark black ink. If something happens to me unexpectedly, Margaret must contact Howard immediately before signing anything. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated softly against the nightstand beside me. I nearly jumped from the sound. Unknown number. My pulse quickened as I answered quietly. Hello. A familiar older voice spoke calmly on the other end. Margaret, this is Howard Ellis. We need to speak before your son asks you to sign any paperwork. The next morning, I met Howard Ellis at a small coffee shop 2 towns over where no one from our neighborhood would recognize us. The October air carried that sharp New England chill that settles into your bones before winter arrives. I arrived 10 minutes early out of habit. Richard hated lateness. Even after 42 years together, I still found myself arriving early because of him. Howard was already seated in the back corner booth wearing a dark wool coat and reading glasses low on his nose. He looked older than I remembered from the funeral, more tired. When he saw me approach, he stood immediately and pulled out the chair across from him with quiet gentleness. Margaret, he said softly, I am very sorry about Richard. Hearing my husband's name spoken kindly nearly unraveled me right there in the middle of the cafe. I wrapped both hands around the paper coffee cup just to steady myself. Howard waited until the waitress walked away before sliding a thick folder carefully across the table toward me. Richard contacted me privately about 6 months ago, he said quietly. He became concerned after discovering irregular activity, connected to several business reserve accounts and property records. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of bank statements, forged authorization forms, and withdrawal requests carrying signatures that looked enough like Richard's handwriting to fool almost anyone at first glance. Almost anyone except his wife. Daniel did this? I whispered. Howard removed his glasses carefully. Daniel signed some documents, yes. But most of the activity appears connected to Vanessa. My chest tightened painfully. Outside the cafe window, leaves drifted slowly across the parking lot beneath a gray sky. For a moment everything around me felt strangely distant, muted somehow, as though my entire life were happening behind thick glass. Howard lowered his voice further. Richard believed Vanessa manipulated Daniel into taking out unauthorized loans against business collateral and portions of the property trust. I stared down at the paperwork. Loan amounts. Transfer dates. Credit lines opened under shell accounts I had never heard of before. Tens of thousands of dollars disappearing slowly over nearly 2 years. Richard had noticed it long before I ever did. Why did he not tell me? I asked quietly. Howard's expression softened sadly. Because he hoped he could fix it without destroying his son. The words settled heavily inside me. That sounded exactly like Richard. Protect the family first. Carry the burden quietly. Absorb damage before letting anyone else feel it. Howard slid one final document toward me. There is something else. I looked down at the page. Emergency refinancing authorization request. The signature line beneath my printed name remained blank. Vanessa plans to have you sign this, Howard explained calmly. If you do, you become legally responsible for the debt attached to those fraudulent accounts. My stomach turned cold instantly. They are trying to transfer everything onto me. Howard nodded once. Richard anticipated that possibility, which is why he moved the house and remaining trust assets solely under your protection before his death. I leaned back slowly against the booth seat, suddenly exhausted in a way grief alone had never caused. For days, I had kept asking myself how my home became so unfamiliar so quickly. Now I understood. The strangers had already been there long before Richard died. Howard folded his hands together carefully. Margaret, listen to me very closely. Do not confront them yet. Let them believe you know nothing. I looked up at him. Why? Because desperate people make mistakes when they feel safe. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. Then Howard reached into his briefcase and handed me a small flash drive sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. Richard installed security cameras in his office after documents started disappearing. My pulse quickened immediately. What is on this? Howard met my eyes steadily. Enough to end this permanently if necessary. Outside, cold rain began falling softly against the cafe windows. I slipped the flash drive into my purse carefully beside Richard's letter. For the first time since the funeral, my hands no longer trembled. They had mistaken grief for weakness. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. Over the next 3 days, I became someone I barely recognized. I smiled when Vanessa spoke to me. I nodded during conversations about bills and refinancing. I even apologized once for being forgetful. After pretending not to understand one of the loan documents she casually left on the kitchen counter for me to notice. Every performance felt unnatural at first, like wearing someone else's skin. But grief changes people in strange ways. It teaches you how to sit quietly beside pain without reacting. And silence, I was beginning to understand, made people careless. Vanessa especially. The more helpless she believed me to be, the more confident she became. She started taking phone calls openly in the kitchen while Daniel was at work. Realtor appointments, bank meetings, conversations about liquidating assets. Once, while she thought I was asleep upstairs, I heard her laughing on speakerphone with a friend. Honestly, the house alone is worth almost $2 million now, she said lightly. Once everything transfers over, we are leaving Connecticut for good. Leaving Connecticut. My husband's house. My family's home. She spoke about it the way someone discusses selling an old handbag online. That evening, Daniel arrived home carrying takeout containers from an expensive Italian restaurant downtown. Vanessa kissed him at the door while I sat quietly in the dining room pretending to read. Their laughter echoed through the hallway with painful familiarity. Richard and I used to sound like that once. Before life became schedules and responsibilities and quiet exhaustion. Daniel looked tired lately. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes now, and his shirts hung looser around his shoulders than they had even a month ago. Guilt ages people quickly. Mom, he said carefully as they unpacked dinner containers onto the kitchen island. Vanessa and I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor tomorrow afternoon. I turned one page slowly in the book resting open on my lap, though I had not actually read a single word. That sounds nice, I answered softly. Vanessa appeared in the doorway carrying a folder tucked neatly beneath her arm. We just want to help organize everything before things become overwhelming for you. There it was again. That word. Help. Every lie in this house arrived wrapped in kindness first. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck nervously. There are some forms that might make things easier financially moving forward. I looked up at him then. Really looked at him. For a brief second, I saw the little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms because he was afraid of lightning. Richard would always pull him close and say, "A Whitmore faces problems directly." I wondered what Richard would think if he could see his son now avoiding eye contact while preparing to hand his widowed mother fraudulent debt. "Of course," I said gently. "Whatever you both think is best." Relief flashed across Vanessa's face so quickly she could not hide it. Later that night, after they went upstairs, I locked my bedroom door quietly and inserted the flash drive Howard gave me into my old laptop. Several security recordings appeared on the screen organized by date and timestamp. My pulse quickened immediately as I clicked the first file. Richard's office appeared on screen exactly as I remembered it. Neat desk. Framed navy photograph. Leather chair near the bookshelf. Then Vanessa entered carrying a stack of documents. She moved confidently toward Richard's desk and opened files like someone who had done it many times before. A few moments later, Daniel walked in behind her looking nervous. "Dad is going to notice eventually," he whispered. Vanessa barely looked up. "Not if we refinance before year end." She slid paperwork toward him across the desk. "Just sign where I marked." Daniel hesitated visibly. I do not know if this is legal. Vanessa laughed softly. Neither is losing the house because your father refuses to modernize the accounts. Then came the moment that made my stomach turn cold. Vanessa removed several pages from a folder and carefully practiced Richard's signature on a blank legal pad before copying it onto official documents. Slowly, methodically, without hesitation, I stared at the glowing laptop screen in complete silence while rain tapped softly against my bedroom windows outside. My husband had not been imagining things. He had been watching his own family steal from him while trying desperately to save them at the same time. The following afternoon, Vanessa transformed the dining room into something that looked more like a corporate meeting space than a family home. Legal folders sat stacked neatly beside crystal water glasses on the polished oak table Richard built by hand almost 30 years earlier. Fresh white lilies stood in the center arrangement where funeral flowers had rested only days before. Even the lighting felt colder somehow. Deliberate. Calculated. I descended the staircase slowly just after 3 o'clock wearing the pale blue cardigan Richard always said made my eyes look brighter. Vanessa glanced up from arranging paperwork and smiled immediately. Too quickly. Too perfectly. There she is, she said warmly. I made tea exactly the way you like it. Daniel stood near the window adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt repeatedly. His nervous habits had become impossible to miss lately. He barely looked at me as I entered the room. Across the table sat a sharply dressed man in his early 50s carrying a leather briefcase embossed with the logo of Fairfield National Bank. Margaret, this is Stephen Caldwell, Vanessa explained smoothly. He is helping us streamline the refinancing process. Streamline. Another harmless word hiding something ugly underneath. I smiled politely and took my seat at the head of the table where Richard always sat during important family discussions. The position felt strange now, almost symbolic. Stephen opened his briefcase and slid several documents neatly across the table toward me. Most of this is routine, he explained with practiced calm. These forms simply authorize debt consolidation under Unified Household Responsibility. Unified Household Responsibility. Such elegant language for burying someone alive financially. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Once this is done, everything becomes easier for everyone. Everyone. Always everyone. Never me specifically. Daniel finally spoke without lifting his eyes from the table. It is just temporary until we stabilize things. I looked down at the paperwork slowly. Signature lines waited neatly at the bottom of several pages beside highlighted tabs Vanessa had carefully prepared in advance. My own name appeared over and over again beside debt figures large enough to destroy everything Richard spent 42 years building. For a long moment no one spoke. The grandfather clock ticked softly from the hallway. Rain tapped lightly against the dining room windows outside. Then I picked up the pen resting beside the documents. Vanessa visibly relaxed. I saw it happen right in front of me. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Daniel released a slow breath through his nose. Stephen straightened the paperwork eagerly. They thought the performance was over. They thought grief had made me blind. I positioned the pen carefully above the signature line. Then I looked directly at Daniel for the first time all afternoon. Your father taught you how to forge his signature surprisingly well, I said quietly. The silence that followed felt enormous. Daniel froze completely. Vanessa's smile vanished so quickly it almost looked painful. Stephen blinked in confusion while glancing between all of us. I set the pen down gently beside the papers. Although, I continued calmly, I suppose years of practice inside Richard's office probably helped. Vanessa recovered first. Margaret, I do not know what you think you are implying. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened visibly around the edge of her folder. I reached into my cardigan pocket slowly and removed the flash drive Howard had given me. Daniel's face lost all color immediately. You should have checked for cameras before practicing signatures at my husband's desk, I said softly. Stephen Caldwell looked sharply toward Vanessa now. Cameras? Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. This is ridiculous. Right on cue, the front doorbell rang through the house. 3 calm, measured chimes. I folded my hands quietly in my lap while Daniel stared at me like a stranger. That would be Howard Ellis, I said. Richard asked him to come if this meeting ever happened. Vanessa's breathing grew shallow now. panic finally breaking through the polished surface she worked so hard to maintain. Daniel looked down at the unfinished documents scattered across the table. His entire body seemed smaller somehow, younger, like a frightened child trapped inside a grown man's mistakes. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Then Howard entered the dining room carrying another thick legal folder beneath his arm. He placed it carefully onto the table beside the refinancing documents and looked directly at Vanessa. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said evenly, "before anyone signs anything today, there are several felony fraud charges we need to discuss." 6 months later, the house finally felt quiet again. Real quiet. Not the tense silence that settles over rooms filled with lies, but the soft kind of peace that arrives after a storm has passed through and taken everything false with it. The maple trees outside the kitchen windows had turned deep shades of orange and crimson again, just like they did every autumn. Richard spent trimming branches in the front yard, while humming old Frank Sinatra songs under his breath. Some mornings, I still caught myself expecting to see him standing beside the coffee maker wearing his navy robe and reading glasses. Grief never leaves completely. It simply learns how to sit beside you more gently over time. The legal process unfolded faster than I expected once Howard submitted the recordings and financial evidence to the investigators. Fairfield National Bank immediately froze every fraudulent refinancing request connected to the house. The forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, altered loan documents. Everything unraveled piece by piece once people started looking closely enough. Vanessa tried denying it at first. Howard told me she blamed misunderstandings, clerical errors, even Richard himself for confusing account structures. But lies become fragile once truth enters the room carrying paperwork. Daniel lasted longer. That hurt more somehow. Even after everything surfaced, part of me kept hoping my son would walk through the front door one final time and say he was sorry. Truly sorry. Not frightened. Not cornered. Just sorry. But shame has a way of hollowing people out from the inside. Daniel moved into a small apartment outside Hartford 3 weeks after the investigation began. Vanessa left before Thanksgiving. Howard later mentioned she accepted a settlement agreement to avoid a lengthy criminal trial, involving additional fraud charges connected to other accounts I never even knew existed. I did not ask for details. By then, I had grown tired of learning how much deception had been living quietly inside my own family. The hardest part was not losing Vanessa. It was understanding how easily greed had separated my son from himself. One cold November afternoon, Daniel finally came back to the house alone. I saw his car pull slowly into the driveway while I was planting winter pansies beside the front porch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked thinner than ever. Older too. Like someone who had not slept peacefully in a very long time. "Mom," he said quietly. His voice cracked slightly on the word. I stood slowly and brushed dirt from my gardening gloves before facing him fully. "Howard said Dad knew for months," Daniel whispered. "I kept telling myself we would fix everything before he found out how bad it got." I studied my son's face carefully. Richard's eyes. Richard's jawline. But none of Richard's steadiness. "Your father spent his entire life protecting this family," I said softly. "Even while you were stealing from him, he was still trying to protect you." Daniel lowered his head immediately. Tears filled his eyes, but he did not let them fall. I never wanted it to go this far. For the first time in months, I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. Evil rarely arrives looking monstrous. Sometimes it arrives tired, weak, easy to manipulate. Vanessa may have started the fire, but Daniel carried the gasoline willingly. We stood there together in silence while cold wind moved softly through the maple trees overhead. Finally, Daniel looked toward the house. "Are you going to sell it?" he asked quietly. I glanced back toward the front windows glowing warm against the gray afternoon sky. Richard's house. My house. The only place where every version of my life still existed all at once. "No," I answered gently. "Some things are not meant to be liquidated." Daniel nodded once slowly. Then he turned and walked back toward his car without another word. I watched him drive away until the taillights disappeared beyond the curve at the end of the street. That night, I sat alone at the dining room table Richard built with his own hands nearly 30 years ago. A single candle flickered softly beside my teacup while rain tapped against the windows outside. The same table where they once tried to bury me beneath debt and betrayal now held only peace. I rested my hand gently against the polished oak surface and smiled faintly into the quiet house around me. They thought becoming a widow would make me powerless. What they forgot was that surviving loss teaches a woman exactly how strong she has always been.